When the last Stuart queen, Anne, died without children, the law said only Protestants could follow, and all of the other Stuarts were Catholic. And so the throne fell to a German family, the Hanovers. We have the first three Georges of the House of Hanover. The interesting thing about the first George is he didn't want to be King of England. He didn't even speak English. He was perfectly happy in Hanover. In fact, he spent as little time in England as he could. And his son after him pretty much followed that same pattern. It's the third George that we're the most familiar with. He's the one that's blamed for losing the colonies in North America to the British Empire. Last week, the British restored the monarchy, and in 1660, King Charles II takes the throne amid great rejoicing. The Puritan killjoys are out of power. Charles is young, he's attractive, he's energetic, but he squanders some of his popularity. He marries a Catholic princess from Portugal and flaunts his mistresses publicly and colorfully, shall we say. And despite all that energy, he has no legitimate heirs. Now, he does have a younger brother, James, but James adds to the tension. James is raised Protestant. His first wife is Protestant. They have 8 children. Only 2 survive, 2 daughters, both raised Protestant. The eldest, Mary, married Prince William of Orange. The second, Anne, married Prince George, a son of the King of Denmark. So the succession was pretty much in good shape. But then James changes the rules. James converts to Catholicism. And he does so openly and publicly. He makes no secret of it. Now, the British restored the monarchy, but the distrust of Catholics still exists. And James is his brother's heir. Then the widowed James remarries Mary of Modena, another Catholic. So Parliament asks James, will you please at least pretend to be Protestant in public? And James says, nope. So then Parliament goes to King Charles and says, will you please cut James out of the succession? And Charles says, nope. And so they have a stalemate. Now there's a lot of hard talk, but nobody wants to go back to the days of the Civil War. And so it's kind of a grin and bear it situation. So James succeeds his brother peacefully in February of 1685. But he quickly antagonizes Parliament. James is, after all, a Stuart. And Parliament is his servant, not his partner. And that's not what they're used to. Then he tries to force through Catholic emancipation. He begins to persecute the Scottish Presbyterians. And he threatens to dissolve again the Church of England. So people are getting a little bit upset with James. And on 10 June 1688, a son is born, another James, who will be raised Catholic. England, Britain, is now in danger of another Catholic secession. And so the Bishop of London and 6 members of Parliament opened negotiation with James' Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, the Prince of Orange. And the negotiation is, how would you like to rule England? And they agree. William and Mary arrive with a huge fleet, larger than the Armada, and foreign troops. But despite that, the invasion, now called the Glorious Revolution, was pretty bloodless. James has to leave the country. He's not happy about it, and really rather childishly, he drops the Great Seal in the Thames as he gets on a ship to leave for France. And so, William and Mary become co-rulers in February of 1689. They are the first co-rulers since Anglo-Saxon times. William comes to rue the decision. The English do not accept foreign rulers easily. And William outlives Mary. In 1701, William agreed to the Act of Settlement. Parliament has decided they are not going to be in the situation they were in with James. The Act of Settlement deliberately removed James II, his son James, and his grandson Charles from ever ruling England. For those of you with Scottish blood, James's grandson is Bonnie Prince Charlie. The settlement also said if William and Mary had no children, Mary's sister Anne would rule after them. So what it does is specify who will be in the line of succession. Not something the king and queen decide, but Parliament decides. And William and Mary do not have any children that survive. They had 8, but they were all stillborn or miscarried. Now, Anne had 19 children, but 14 were stillborn or miscarried. 4 died while they were babies, and 1 only lived to be 11. And so she has no children either to succeed after her. But she does leave her mark on the country. Now, this is a woman who didn't want to rule, was not trained to rule, has none of the skills to rule, and she makes a magnificent queen. If you have time, she's a good one to look into. Among the things Anne does is in 1707, she signed the Act of Union, formally merging Scotland and England into a single kingdom. It is the birth of Great Britain. Now, the term Great Britain had been used by mapmakers since James I's reign, but had not been recognized politically, and so this is the birth date of Great Britain. Anne is also the last English sovereign to refuse to accept parliamentary bills. Really, after Anne, the English nobility, the English monarchy, lose the right of veto. Anne's dearest relative was Sophia, a granddaughter of James I, and she had married the Duke of Hanover, a German principality. The Act of Settlement specifically named Sophia as Anne's heir if she had no surviving children. But Sophia is 20 years older than Anne, and she dies 6 weeks before Anne does. And so the settlement, the succession, goes to Sophia's son, George Louis of the Royal House of Hanover. If the English were less than pleased with a Dutch king, they are not pleased at all with a German one. So strong pressure is put on James II's son, James, to at least pretend to be Protestant. Okay, you don't really have to change, but at least publicly, go to the Church of England, pretend to be Protestant, and we'll let you be king. And he does think about it, but he comes back and says, no, I'm not going to do that. And so a new family comes to rule England, now Great Britain, the House of Hanover. The House of Hanover lasts almost 200 years, from 1714 to 1901. And the house includes 4 Georges, 1 William, and a lady named Victoria. The rulers included 2 renowned for their attention to morality, maybe too much attention, and 4 who pushed the bounds the other way a little too hard. The Hanovers ruled in a time and in a world that is changing as fast as the one we live in today. In 1765, Robert Clive captured Bengal for the East India Trading Company, and the British spread across India. In the 1770s, Australia was discovered, and the first settlers, 800 of them convicts, arrive almost immediately thereafter. William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, all begin writing their masterpieces during George III's reign. Now, George III will lose the United States, but in the World War that accompanied our revolution, he gained Trinidad, Tobago, St. Lucia, Sri Lanka, the Mauritius, Cape Colony, and Malta. Very widespread and large colonies around the world. By 1850, just 30 years after George III died, Britain practically monopolized all world trade. Victoria became Empress of India, and under her rule, Britain gained control of New Zealand, Egypt, the Sudan, Gambia, the Gold Coast, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. The sun really did shine, always, on some part of the British Empire. But the first Hanover king arrives with very little enthusiasm on either side. George Louis was crowned King George I of Great Britain on 20 October 1714. George loved Hanover. It was small, but it was his. The people were obedient, and they let him rule as he liked. In Hanover, he decided everything. Every expenditure over 13 pounds required George's personal approval. And the army was his private toy. Britain, on the other hand, was the most independent, fractious, precedent-ridden country in all of Europe, and everybody knew it. He's perfectly comfortable, and now he's got to take on this very hard-to-rule group of people. He's so thrilled to be crowned, he takes 8 weeks to travel between Hanover and London. He stops at every stream, every hamlet, and every cloud passing the sky. When he finally arrives in London, he faces a parliament and people who are royally ticked off at him. What took you so long? George was 54, the oldest heir to that date. And before 1701, nobody thought he'd be king. How on earth would somebody who rules Hanover be king of England? So he has no training. He doesn't know English government. He doesn't know English culture. He doesn't know English laws. He speaks no English. Now he struggles to learn a few phrases. What's for dinner? Send money. Your place or mine. Now you may laugh, but George's main interests were food, money, horses, and women, not necessarily in that order. And since few people in England spoke German, George tried to conduct government in French, which was the diplomatic language of the day. But not everybody in England, not in the House of Commons certainly, and not in society, spoke French. And so in some cases they resorted to Latin. The joke was that the House of Commons had created a boom in publishing of Latin texts, and you could earn a very good living teaching Latin refresher courses throughout England at the time. Think about it. A major country, a world power, conducting its government in foreign languages. Amazing. Now, George did have a fallback. When they were speaking to each other, which was seldom, his son, Prince George Augustus, helped translate. Prince George Augustus spoke English, but with such a strong German accent that many people said whatever he spoke, it wasn't English. But he could translate for Dad when he was there. But the two men feuded. Okay, George I and his son hated each other. And they hated each other because George I, who is a rounder in any stage of the term, had caught his wife Sophia in an affair, and he had imprisoned her. Her lover disappeared. Then he divorced her and left her in prison for the rest of her life. His son, George Augustus, was only 11, and he never forgave his father. But that's a Hanover trait. Generation after generation, every Hanover fights with the oldest son, except in one case, when they fight with the oldest daughter. I didn't know that was a genetic thing, but with the Hanovers it definitely is. On his side, Dad, George I, retaliated by refusing to give his son any power whatsoever. He even withheld the title of regent when he's away in Hanover. Now, by law, somebody's got to be in charge of England. And George does not trust his ministers. He's mad at his son. He's going to leave the country. He finally grudgingly agrees that his son can call himself the protector or guardian of the realm while he's gone, in case some crisis comes up, but he gives him very little power. He is not given a regent's power. And when they are feuding, the prince is banished from the court. And so with no translation available from the prince, George I spends very little time with his ministers. He does not attend Privy Council meetings. The day-to-day direction, the day-to-day control of government slips from the king's hands. And the Privy Council becomes an independent cabinet for all practical purposes. Now, George wasn't a total loss. He survived a Jacobite rebellion when James II tries to regain his throne. And he brought George Friedrich Handel to England. All that glorious music. But his greatest gift to his new country, Great Britain, was his neglect. He allowed Parliament and his cabinet to grow in power and independence. And constitutional democracy developed really by default. He's not there, he's not paying attention. On June the 10th, 1727, George I suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. He died in the same room in Hanover where he was born, and he's buried in Hanover. Nobody even said, why don't we bring the King of Britain home to Britain to be buried? He was that unpopular. George II was not prepared to rule. Dad had not allowed him any practice, any training, any experience in making decisions in Great Britain or in Hanover. Now, before he's king, the prince kind of gets even with Dad. He cultivated the English and their politics. He studied genealogy and English history. He spoke Italian and French and sort of English. He had a passion for detail and uniforms, the battlefield, and the minutiae of court etiquette. He drove everybody crazy over his emphasis on etiquette. You know, 2 steps forward, mince, bow, all this kind of stuff was not an English tradition. And now he wants to reintroduce that. He is the last English monarch to lead troops in battle. He was quick-tempered and arrogant, and like his father, he took an extensive interest in the ladies. He had a chief mistress, and he had minor mistresses, as well as occasional one-night stands with maids and passers-by. And just to keep the tradition going, George and his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, hated their firstborn, Frederick. George referred to him as my half-witted coxcomb, and once told his ministers, our firstborn is the greatest ass, the greatest liar, and the greatest beast in the whole world, and we heartily wish he was out of it. Frederick, in his conversations with friends, described his father as an obstinate, self-indulgent, miserly martinet with an insatiable sexual appetite. It's obviously a loving relationship. Now, Frederick made poor choices. He spent too much on art. He loved sports, which his father did not. He gambled heavily. He's always in debt. He took mistresses across the social classes. He has at least one illegitimate son. But he does nothing his father and grandfather didn't do, and probably in a larger sense. But there are problems. Frederick is more popular than Dad. So there's some fear there, and there's some jealousy there. And while he's more popular, which would be a problem anyway, Frederick also kind of made the opposition party his to support. So he's kind of the loyal opposition to his father in Parliament. The problem is, even as a boy, George II could tolerate no opposition whatsoever. One of his tutors wrote of him, whenever he meets opposition to his designs, he thinks the opposers are rebels to the will of God. Sounds like a Stuart, doesn't it? But George gets his wish. Frederick dies before him, 9 years before him. Frederick's only 44. It's unexpected and quick. Historians think it was an aneurysm. So George is happy, except Frederick has left children. So he's still got to deal with Frederick's bloodline. Now George II also faces Jacobites. I don't want to leave you with Scottish blood out of this. And Bonnie Prince Charlie invades Scotland in 1745. George sends his favorite and most ruthless son, William, Duke of Cumberland, to deal with the invasion. The Scottish defeat at Culloden in April 1746 was followed by the vicious destruction of the clans. William, Duke of Cumberland, earns his nickname, the Butcher. George II's reign is also known for gains during the French and Indian War, what the Europeans call the 7 Years' War. British forces under General James Wolfe take Canada from France. Now, Wolfe was an interesting man, not particularly conventional, and the British Parliament never takes well to unconventional generals. And so one member of Parliament complained to King George that Wolfe was mad. George II was not particularly impressed. His answer is one of my very favorite quotes from an English king. "Oh, he's mad, is he? Then I hope he will bite some of my other generals." George II grew steadily more German in his rule. And Parliament and people grow steadily more resistant to that German dogmatism. So he began to spend more and more time in Hanover, just like his dad did. Nothing English suited him. "I am sick to death of all this foolish stuff, and wish with all my heart that the devil may take all your bishops and your ministers and your parliament and the whole island, provided I can get out of it and go back to Hanover." He's obviously not having a good time. George II capped his unpopularity by dying in a particularly embarrassing way. He had a heart attack sitting on the toilet in London. His grandson, Frederick's son, came to the throne on October 25th, 1760. George III is both well known and really unknown to most Americans. He's the tyrant who forced the colonists into rebellion. He's the despot in the Declaration of Independence. And we all know, or should know, the opening and closing words of the Declaration of Independence. But the majority of the Declaration, almost a whole page, is a list of personal accusations against George III. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly. He has made justices dependent on his will alone. He has quartered troops among us, cut off our trade with all parts of the world, imposed taxes on us without our consent, and much more. And yet he was loved in Britain. He's considered a good, caring king, one of the best, in fact. For them, his greatest fault was allowing things to get so bad that the colonists revolted. and for not surrendering the Civil War in the colonies early enough. For British historians, our revolution is a civil war. It's often called a war of secession. We are seceding, as South Carolina does, from the Union. And so for them, George's fault was he let things get too bad, so people had to revolt, and he didn't stop it soon enough so they could come to an agreement and still remain at least within the empire together. But he wasn't a tyrant. He didn't persecute them. He was a good king at home. And so I want to concentrate the rest of this class on looking at the events of George III's reign, not through our eyes, but through his eyes, to understand what was going on and why things got so bad, why all the attempts for us to come to some accommodation with the mother country failed. George III was the first Hanover monarch, born in England and raised within English culture. He also spoke English without an accent. Well, at least to them, he didn't have an accent. He never visited Hanover, even though he remained their ruler. But then he's not much of a traveler. He also never went to Wales, never went to Ireland, and probably never visited Scotland. George was the second child and first son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, Frederick and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. He was born in London in Norfolk House on June the 4th, 1738. He was 2 months premature. He was not expected to survive. And so they immediately christened him, baptized him, George William Frederick. But he surprised him. He survived and thrived. And unlike his father, Frederick was a conscientious father to his children. And he has 5 sons and 4 daughters, as well as 1 illegitimate son. He wrote them when he's away, and the kids kept the letters. The letters are teasing, they're loving, they're concerned. He shared with them. This is a father who teaches his children. He shared with them his interest in art and science, gardening and astronomy, music, and amateur theatricals, which, by the way, George III hated. George II took little interest in his grandchildren. Just like he didn't care too much for Frederick, he did not care too much for Frederick's kids. He did nominate grandson George as a Knight of the Garter on George's 11th birthday, but only because he was being criticized by members of Parliament. And so he has it made up, but he sends no personal note, he just hands it to a secretary to address. It doesn't go with dear grandson or congratulations, nothing personal. Frederick died when George was 12. He left George a letter that George kept and reread often. I shall have no regret never to have worn the crown if you but fill it worthily. Convince the nation you are not only an Englishman born and bred, but that you are also this by inclination. Live with economy and endeavor to reduce the national debt and the rate of interest. When mankind will once be persuaded that you are just, humane, generous, and brave, you will be beloved by your people and respected by foreign powers. Not the typical letter a dad leaves his son, is it? It's not one my father ever wrote me, that's for sure. But George cherished it. Mother Augusta was a perfectionist who showed her love by constant criticism. She thought Parliament was too powerful. 2 kings, kind of absentee kings, had allowed too much power to go over to Parliament. And so she tells George he needs to be more powerful when he has the crown. Be a king! He's always telling him that, nagging him. With his father's death, George is now Prince of Wales, and suddenly a lot of people are paying attention to him. And so they take over his education with an eye to their power and control. And they kind of forget that they're dealing with a child. His schoolroom was a struggle between the 2 political parties and people who want political control. Young George is shy. He's not quick, but he is intellectually curious. He speaks 4 languages: English, Latin, French, and German. He loved astronomy, art, architecture, and agriculture. His entire life, new farming techniques, new developments in farming fascinate him. He even tries them out on the home farm at Windsor, and that's how he gets his nickname, Farmer George. He played the harpsichord, he played the flute, he tried to play the violin. But you can say that about a lot of violin players, I think. All he knew about his people, though, his future subjects, was what he read in his books and what his tutors told him. He lacked self-confidence, but was intensely, intensely stubborn. He had no people skills, was taught none. He's friendly and charming when he's not being crossed. A little bit of granddad there. He's emotionally immature and very inexperienced. He's kind of isolated. For you conspiracy buffs, there is a continuing story about this most prim and proper young man. The story is, at age 13, he seduces a 21-year-old Quaker woman named Hannah Lightfoot. They have 3 children, and he eventually marries her in 1757 or maybe 1759, when he was 19 or 21. It's a good story. There are some holes in it, and the documentation is very shaky. His letters at 13 are very immature, very pious, very preachy, very naive. But, of course, that did not stop the Victorians from major debauchery. But George also took very seriously his future role as head of the Church of England. So much so that he really is a religious bigot. And dissenters, and Quakers are considered dissenters at the time, were not really socially acceptable, and their religion was misguided at best. So there's nothing we know of George that really supports the story. And he certainly supported the search for a wife in 1760. But Hannah Lightfoot did exist. She did have a powerful keeper. She did have children with her keeper. And George did leave her a small sum in his will. Now, the more likely scenario is probably Hannah's keeper was one of his 2 uncles. George's uncles, his 4 brothers, and his sons spread their genetic material and companionship as far and widely as they can. But Hannah's descendants to this day continue to insist that they are the rightful royal family. And so if you want to explore more of that, see Jan Bondison's The Great Pretenders. At 17, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, became George's tutor and friend. He's a handsome Scotsman. There are conflicting stories about him as well. One story is that he was Mother Augusta's lover and a rogue. The other, that he was a pious, loving, faithful family man and just overly ambitious. Either way, he is the greatest influence on George at this time. Bute was an intellectual, interested in science, but he also lacked people skills. He also lacked any understanding of how the common people lived. He told George he could learn everything he needed to know to be king out of a book. He did not need to communicate with people. He also taught George the first duty of a king was to lead a moral life. Bute's real ambition was to be prime minister. And George trusted him. He called him my dearest friend and wrote him, I am young and inexperienced and want advice. I trust in your friendship and assistance in all difficulties. It's kind of sad, isn't it? At 7:30 Saturday morning, October 25th, 1760, the 22-year-old Prince of Wales set out for his regular morning ride. A little bit after 8, a messenger reaches him. Your grandfather has had a serious accident. He's actually had that heart attack on the toilet in London. George immediately writes a message for someone to take to Bute. I shall wait till I hear from you to know what further must be done. Won't even take an action without him. Within a few minutes, another messenger comes with a letter from his aunt telling him, no, it's not an accident, Granddad's dead. And now the young George is king. Can do anything. What does he do? He rides back, calls up a carriage, and goes to Bute. Doesn't even wait for him to come to him. So Privy Council member William Pitt and Prime Minister George Newcastle come at once. They need to talk to the new king. And he's not where they expected him to be. They have to go to Bute's home. And Bute greets them and makes them cool their heels for over an hour. Won't let them see the king. When they finally see him, George tells them, my Lord Bute is your very good friend. He will tell you my thoughts at large. Pretty clear who's in charge at this point, isn't it? Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Bute's not up to the job. He does help George oust William Pitt from Commons. Pitt is head of the Whig Party, and they're the ones with all the power. And George is determined, as his mother had been nagging him, to take back some of that power. And so he wants to oust William Pitt from Commons. And Bute does help him do that. But Bute's not very good at working Parliament or people. And he makes so many enemies that he's almost immediately a political liability. And so he doesn't last long. George's first speech to Parliament reflected his father's advice and not Bute's. I was born and educated in this country. I glory in the name of Britain. George took the throne at an incredible time. London had over 500,000 inhabitants. It's the largest city in Western Europe. There are 2 revolutions underway. No, not the one in North America yet. The 2 revolutions are in agriculture and in industry. The 1760s are the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There are new ideas about crop rotation and land reclamation. Whole populations were displaced in Scotland as homes were destroyed to make way for sheep. The Scots left for France, North America, and Australia. James Watt's new steam engine required coal. The rural poor of Wales and England moved to new towns outside coal mines. Towns we know today very well: Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester. New advances in spinning and weaving and the making of iron encouraged an explosive growth in cotton mills and smelting works. The demand for these new industries was so great that work went on 24 hours a day, around the clock. And children barely old enough and barely tall enough to see over the loom were working 16 and 18-hour days, 7 days a week. It is not until the early 1800s that Parliament finally passes laws restricting child labor to children over the age of 9 and to no more than 12 hours a day. We're not as overworked as we think we are. With all this going on, George's first priority is to clean up the immorality in his grandfather's court. And within a month, he issued a royal proclamation for the encouragement of piety and virtue. We're back to legislating virtue. George was also the first unmarried man to take the throne in over 100 years, depending on, of course, Hannah Lightfoot's real status. George had his advisors go on a wife hunt. George's criteria: she had to have a pleasant disposition, good understanding, but not intellectual, able to bear children. Beauty was not a requirement. Above all, he wanted a wife who would not meddle in politics. Now, that may have been Mom's influence. Mom's a little too involved. Or it just could have been that his own lack of self-confidence meant he did not want anybody competing with him. In June 1761, George picked 17-year-old Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. They had never met, and she spoke no English. Now, George was to be crowned in September, and he wanted his bride to be crowned with him, a combined crowning. He asked her to arrive for a wedding at least a month before investiture. However, first her mother died, and then George got chickenpox, and so her arrival is delayed. She finally reached England by ship late on 7 September. The next morning, her coach left for London, arriving at 3:30 in the afternoon. She was met not by George, but by his brother, Edward. Edward introduces her to her husband-to-be. She got an embrace and then was taken to meet the rest of the family. At an hour or two later, they sat down to tea and hopefully a bathroom break. It's been a long day. And at 9 p.m., they were married. This man that she met at 3:30 in the afternoon, she marries that night at 9. Edward escorted her down the aisle and reportedly said, "Courage, princess, courage," when he felt her tremble. Nerves, maybe just exhaustion, both. Poor little thing. After the wedding, there was a dinner and a party at which Charlotte sang and played the harpsichord. The newlyweds retired at 3 in the morning. Welcome to Britain. 2 weeks later, both were crowned. A young man named John Hancock extended his only trip to London to see the coronation. Another colonial, Benjamin Franklin, also attended. Benjamin Franklin had been a representative, an agent for Pennsylvania since 1757, and he's invited. Ben Franklin described the young king as the very best in the world and the most amiable. 2 months later, newspapers describing the event arrived in North America. John Adams described one of the new king's speeches in his diary. His Majesty has declared himself by his speech in his parliament to be a friend of liberty and property and a patron of merit. These are sentiments worthy of a king. He will change his mind about that. George vowed to be his grandfather's opposite. He was faithful and devoted his entire marriage. Now, he did not love Charlotte when they married. He'd known her less than 24 hours, for heaven's sakes. But after 44 years of marriage, he called her the queen of my heart. He bought Buckingham House for her in 1762. It became the family residence and has been ever since. Now, that doesn't look like Buckingham Palace, does it? Well, George's son, George IV, and George's son, William IV, he has two sons who come after him, added to it. Now, they obviously spent a lot of time with their children. You see a lot of portraits of George and Charlotte and the kids. And it's an attractive family. There are a lot of stories of George involved with his children. They obviously spent a lot of time together, George and Charlotte. They produce 15 children, and all but 13 survive long into adulthood. Despite, or maybe because of, George and Charlotte's particularly rigorous parenting, all of the boys and a couple of the girls resort to typical Hanover behavior. One of their daughters, Sophia, even has a child out of wedlock, which for this time is pretty shocking. George's devotion to Charlotte did not include confiding in her or using her as an advisor. He made sure Charlotte had a horror of politics. So much so that she hated even talking to members of Parliament for fear they would drag her into a political discussion. Now, Charlotte's education was not what it should have been. But she's a very intelligent lady. She has the will to learn. and she learns English. She becomes very fluent. She shares her husband's love of music. She studies pottery and furniture and becomes a great collector. She's added tremendously to some treasures that belong to the royal family today. She loved to read in English and German and French. And in their private moments, George and Charlotte spoke German. That way the servants couldn't understand them when they were cooing and billing. Now, she's no beauty. She's short, extremely thin her entire life. But then George is no Adonis. He's got those protruding eyes, and he has very bad eyesight. And so he kind of squints and peers at people and papers and things. So he can't complain about Charlotte's lack of looks. But both of them, as I said, were devoted to their family and spent as much time with the kids as they could. And George is frequently seen carrying one of the kids around. And he's caught more than once on the floor playing with them. He often also strolled into the cottages of his farm workers unannounced to talk to them. Now, I don't know about you, I don't want the king walking in without somebody giving me a few minutes warning. But he did that. He encouraged their children to play on the grounds at Windsor. They played cricket, they flew kites, they played soccer, football. But now the royal children were not encouraged to play with the farm children. But it wasn't bigotry. The royal children were not allowed to play with any children except the family. Worried about the Hanover traits, Hanover after Hanover is anything but a virtuous person, and Charlotte and George are worried about that in their children, and not too happy with what they see as immorality in court. They isolate their children. So their children can only be involved with the household. They are as isolated as George was. You'd think he would have turned that around, but he doesn't. He isolates his children. Now, he and Charlotte are very social. George, in particular, despite being shy when he's young, is very good in social environments. He speaks to everybody at the receptions, loved a good joke, loved gossip of the court. Now, he's not a good teller of jokes. His jokes are labored. His timing is off. But he's the king, so he always gets a good laugh. George took the throne in the closing days of the French and Indian War, and he hated the war, which is with France and Spain. He thought it was too expensive. It was a burden that the country could not stand. The problem is, Britain was winning. He had won the war. This is no time to give up on it. But George insists, as soon as he's crowned, I want peace now. No, don't take time. He vetoes William Pitt's plan to get massive concessions. Pitt planned to beggar both France and Spain, so they'd never be competition again. But George says, no, I want peace and I want it now. And so all of that work, all of those victories, goes really for nothing because he's being forced into a peace. And the French and Spanish know it. And so it costs Great Britain a great deal in lands and concessions and in money. And so instead of getting money from the losers, the winners are left deeply in debt after the French and Indian War. And so a desperate parliament starts looking at the colonies, especially the rich colonies in North America, for more taxes and money to make up the deficit. And the colonials in North America are not open to that. They immediately begin complaining. Parliament is becoming a little bit of a challenge also. George hated political parties, and he did his best his entire reign to ignore them. Now, during George I and George II's reign, the Whigs were in control of Parliament and did pretty much as they wanted to. And so the new king decides he's going to take back the power that his grandfather and great-grandfather lost, and he's going to reduce the power of the political parties. He will be the king his mother wants him to be. Now you may ask, where did the parties come from? Well, the two political parties at the time, the Whigs and Tories, emerged during Charles II's reign. You remember early in the talk today, we said Charles was a Protestant. His brother James, who was his heir, converts to Catholicism. And Parliament wanted James to either pretend to be a Protestant or get out of the line of succession. And the political parties grow from that argument. The Whigs are the ones that want James out of the succession. The Tories want James left in the succession. And so over time, the Whigs have become the party of the people, a party that believes that sovereignty is a gift from the people to the throne, to Parliament, and must be handled with accountability. Their aim is to reduce the power of the throne. The Tories are really the royalists from the Civil War, and they think the crown is supreme and should even have more power than precedence allows them to have. And so what you have are two parties that grow up, one wanting civil power, representative power, not the monarch, not the throne having the power, and the Tories who are more traditional and want the king at the top of the hierarchy with the power that goes with that. And so to gain back the power his grandfather and great-grandfather lost, George is going to break the Whigs. He's got to dig them out of control of Parliament. And he wants to make the prime minister and the cabinet, who have become very powerful, because the two kings before him weren't paying attention, he wants to make them his servants, in fact, as well as name. It will be his policy that they will bring to law, not theirs. So he decides he will welcome Tories back, and he will appoint men he likes, not powerful men, not men who are necessarily very good at working with Parliament. And things get a little bit confusing. He's got a lot of relative amateurs now as ministers. And so a very disgusted and frustrated Prime Minister Newcastle leaves. And we get revolving prime ministers. George is shopping for a prime minister that will do what he wants, will be his man. Now, the best of the prime ministers at this time is a man named George Grenville. Though Grenville was the ablest man in the House of Commons, though he was the best at achieving what George wanted, George hated him more than any other man in politics at the time. Now, there's no basic difference between them politically. They're absolutely 100% in agreement on what to do about the American trouble. The problem was, in any debate, Grenville would keep at it until you gave in on every detail. He would not compromise on anything. If he started with a stand, he would stay with that until you gave up in exhaustion, if nothing else. And so his favorite occupation was talking. And George hated that self-righteousness that he brought to any argument. But the problem was, George liked to talk too. And George is king. He's right. And for some reason, they couldn't share being right. Both of them needed to be righter than the other one was. And so their communications were just a little bit strained. George complained about Grenville. When he has wearied me for 2 hours, he looks at his watch to see if he may not tire me for an hour more. The king's small revenge was to never remember his name. He called him Mr. Grenville. Now, George III is not a politician, not initially. He will learn to be one, but in the early days he's not. And he dislikes emotional scenes. He doesn't handle confrontation well. He'd never learned how to handle a political crisis, much less a personal crisis. So George's American policy was very simple. The colonies must be reduced to absolute obedience, if necessary by force. the authority of the crown, the authority of Parliament are immutable. For the Americans to challenge them is treason. If the colonies obey, then Great Britain should be very generous to them. They are, after all, Britons. He'd been reluctant to use troops when the colonists argued, yelled about the Stamp Act in 1765. You may recall from that time that the colonists began to boycott British products because of the Stamp Act. And there was some thought in Parliament that we'll send troops over there and we'll make them. And George was reluctant. That wasn't the way to go. But he's livid in March of 1766 when Parliament repeals the Stamp Act. It was not where he wanted to go. So by late 1766, he's frustrated, he's angry, he doesn't like Grenville, and he just wants a settled prime minister and cabinet so he can get on with taking back some power. He finally got his wish in Frederick Lord North. Our history books paint poor Lord North as the worst prime minister possible. But North was really the Lyndon Johnson of his day. He's a master at working Parliament, and he maintains a majority in Parliament for over 10 years. He's a great power player, very skillful. His problem was the war. He has no military experience. Had this been a peaceful time, he'd have made a great prime minister. But he has no experience, and he has to depend on the advice of the very worst military advisors in all of British history. Not to mention a king who will not even consider surrender, no matter how bad the war gets. So he's caught. And poor North tries to resign at least 3 times. The last time he's almost in tears, he's begging. He knows he's not the man for the job. He knows he's not doing well by the country. He wants out. Let somebody come in who can do a better job. But George liked North. He didn't want anybody else in, and he will not let North resign. So Lord North is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. George explained his political conduct in a confidential letter that was supposed to be instructions to his eldest son, as his father left him. I do not pretend to any superior abilities, but will give place to no one in meaning to preserve the freedom, the happiness, and glory of my dominions, and all their inhabitants. That I have erred is undoubted, otherwise I should not be human. But I flatter myself all unprejudiced persons will be convinced that whenever I have failed, it has been from the head and not from the heart. But his stubborn disposition, his refusal to consider other options once they've started down a path, and his inability to compromise grow into major weaknesses, not just for George, but for the conduct of the war. He was always certain he was right. He never waver on the American question. I know I am doing my duty, and therefore can never wish to retreat, for firmness is the characteristic of an Englishman. He's kind of boxing himself in. Even after Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown in October 1781, George remained unshaken. He ordered his ministers to find a way to continue the war. Now they've lost their army. Find a way to keep this going. But apart from a few diehards, Parliament is pretty much decided. This war of secession, this civil war, is over. It's lost. The conflict in North America is now eating resources they need to apply to the much larger, much more dangerous, and right now more successful world war that's going on with Spain, with France, and with Holland. The diehards don't want to give up in North America because they're afraid if they give independence to the colonists, it'll start a domino effect. starting with Ireland. And they can't afford to have Ireland an enemy sitting so close as they are. George agrees with the diehards. He has not given up one iota of the land he inherited. He would abdicate rather than give it up, and says so. But the will to win the Civil War was never strong in England. There were as many people for the rebels as against. And that feeling grows. The city of London formally petitions the king to end the war with the American colonists. For 2 months, Parliament debates. Smaller and smaller majorities resisted motions ending the war. On December 12th, it lost by 41. In mid-February, by 1. On February 28, 1782, it carried. Charles Fox, the head of Commons, told the king, "This house will consider as enemies to his majesty and this country all those who shall advise the further persecution of offensive war." To refuse would mean confrontation with Parliament. George must comply or step down. George III actually drafted an abdication statement. He is not giving up. His Majesty is convinced that the sudden change of sentiments of one branch of the legislature has totally incapacitated him from either conducting the war with effect or from obtaining any peace but on conditions which would prove destructive to the commerce and essential rights of the British nation. His Majesty, therefore, with much sorrow, finds he can be of no further utility to his native country, which drives him to the painful step of quitting it forever. He does not sign it. They convince him not to. One of the most telling arguments to keep him from abdicating was reminding him that if he did, he would be alive to see his oldest son rule. And he does not want to have to see that. So that warfare between Hanovers worked to the country's favor this time. The Treaty of Paris is signed in September 1783, and North can finally resign. The political problems created, though, by the fall of the North government are pretty tremendous. And the Whigs go after King George. The Whigs describe George as a despot who had squandered his subjects' blood and treasury in his lust for revenge, and they pushed to restrict the king's power more. But the George of spring 1784 had grown politically. He'd learned from Lord North. He'd learned timing, and he'd learned how to work with and around Parliament. He personally chose the new Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. William Pitt the Younger is 24 years old, but despite his youth, this is a very bright and very effective politician. He's a superb leader. He remains in power for 21 years through the dangerous years of the French Revolution. He is the first of the modern prime ministers and the first to actually be prime minister by name. He serves a king who has also become a master manipulator. George commented on his ministers' performances. When they give speeches, when they are in Parliament, he rates them. It's like a report card. Criticizes them and praises them and tells them what he thinks and gives his advice. And each letter, each note that he sends to him is signed, and it even has the minute and the day when the note's finished, so he can keep up with all these things. The mid to late 1780s are probably the best years of George's career. Things are going well. Under Pitt, Britain fast regains its trade, its self-confidence, its world position. Even the pesky Americans join in a trade alliance. All those resources are available without now having to pay for the colonies. What a good idea. And George told his ministers, "It is to be hoped we shall reap more advantages from their trade as friends than ever we could derive from them as colonies." Sounds like things are going well. But on June the 1st, 1785, George III is forced by protocol to receive the first ambassador from the United States. It's John Adams, the man who had persuaded the Continental Congress to vote for independence. John Adams described the meeting in a long letter to John Jay. "After making 3 ceremonial bows, I informed the king that the United States wished to cultivate the most liberal and friendly intercourse with your Majesty's subjects. I was instructed to extend my country's best wishes for your Majesty's health and for that of your royal family. I would be the happiest of men if I could help restore esteem, confidence, and affection, or in better words, the old good nature and good humor between people who, though separated by an ocean and under separate governments, have the same language and kindred blood." The king, he said, was much affected. He replied with a tremor in his voice, telling me I was the last to consent to separation. But the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the states as an independent power. Very gracious. He's much less gracious several months later when John Adams brings Thomas Jefferson to the court. The king never forgave Thomas Jefferson for all those personal accusations in the Declaration of Independence. Some stories say the king turned his back on Thomas Jefferson, but there's no record of that in John Adams' diary or anybody else's, and I think they would have noticed that. Americans were a little prickly about things like that in those days. But then we're a new country. We're kind of, making our way, trying to become a force in the world, and we were a very small country. But aside from that, George III's doing fine. He's enjoying things. He's had one minor illness in 1765. He got a cold that almost made pneumonia, but he's been in excellent health so far. He has 15 children. Nobody can say he didn't ensure the secession. Pitt has politics under control. Things are going well. George could relax and study botany. He writes pamphlets on botany and on agriculture under an alias. He used the name Ralph Richardson, which was the name of one of his shepherds. The one dark spot is his growing antagonism with his oldest son, the future Prince Regent. As with the other Georges, fault is on both sides. George III was too protective. Way too protective of his children. He loved them, but he wanted them to stay children. He didn't want them to grow up. And so he wouldn't allow them to try things out, to move beyond the protection of the family. His dictates were too restrictive for the lively and high-spirited, way too high-spirited Prince of Wales. But during the summer of 1788, George is feeling sick. He has bilious attacks, stomach pains. He has difficulty breathing, aching joints, and a rash. Now, one of his doctors says it's gout, but George says no. He can still move both knees. He can still walk. It's not gout. His pulse rises to above 140, but the doctors think that's a good sign. Fevers came and went with delirium. It's not good. On October 16th, 1788, George fell into convulsions after riding in the rain. And when he recovers from the convulsions, he's just talking like this and like this and like this. He just can't hush. A page who had been dismissed, who'd been fired, said he saw the king talking to a tree as if the tree was the king of Prussia. Now that story made the rounds, but we think that was probably only sour grapes for losing the job. But on November 5th, during a dinner at Windsor, George attacked the Prince of Wales and tried to smash his head against the wall. Throughout the attack, he shouts gibberish. He foams at the mouth. And a servant says his eyes were so bloodshot they looked like currant jelly. The king recovered physically, but not mentally. He was declared deranged and isolated. His treatment was barbaric. Lectures and threats. You will get well. They bound him to an iron chair and force-fed him. They applied poultices of Spanish fly and mustard that raised horrific blisters all over his body. The thought was the blisters would raise and remove the evil humors in his body that were creating or causing the mental instability. They tried bloodletting, of course. You try that for everything. And they put leeches on his temples, again, trying to remove what they thought was a poison in the brain. His doctors reported the loss of his American colonies just ate at him. He couldn't seem to let go of it. In one lucid moment, he told them, "I shall never lay my head on my last pillow in peace and quiet as long as I remember the loss of my American colonies." His wife and children were advised to stay away. The doctors said they might agitate him, make him worse. Gouverneur Morris, an American delegate to France, wrote George Washington that the French court was gossiping, was talking about George's troubles. And one favorite story that he passed on to George Washington was that George III imagined himself to be the second coming of George Washington. But despite the very best and hardest work of his doctors, George got better. He gradually regained his reason and attended a service of thanksgiving for his recovery in St. Paul's Cathedral on April the 23rd, 1789. The attack had lasted about 4.5 months. Earlier in November, when people thought the king would die and the Prince of Wales would rule, there's a panic on the stock exchange. People greeted his recovery with joy and relief, and everywhere he went, people hang out flags and bunting, and they stand and they cheer him. He goes swimming at Weymouth, and a local band marches into the sea playing God Save the King. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't expect to be swimming and look up and see a band marching toward me into the waves. His family was very uneasy about being with him again. They're worried he's going to have a relapse. And he's angry with them because they didn't come see him. Now, they told him the doctor said no, but he thought they should have been there anyway. You know, he's been pretty badly abused, and there was nobody there to defend him, and his family doesn't even come see him. There's some evidence that George and Charlotte's marriage suffered for a while. Based on the symptoms, historians think that George inherited porphyria. It's a blood disease that wasn't diagnosed until 1950, so he's a little bit ahead of his time. There was no way to treat it. Porphyria essentially poisons the blood and the nervous system, including the brain. The longer you live with it, normally the worse the symptoms become. Recent medical investigation of George shows that he also had some significant amounts of arsenic in his system. Now, for us, the first thing we'd think of is somebody was trying to poison him, but they don't think that's what it was. Arsenic at that time was, in fact, a medication you might use for certain things. And so what they think is his doctors were poisoning with arsenic, hoping that that would help. The problem is arsenic would worsen the symptoms, and so he's kind of in a bad loop there. But he's better, he's back in power, all is well, no problems, no physical, no mental problems from this 4.5 months of horror. In 1789, the French Revolution breaks out. It's a massive crisis for Britain, both politically because they have their own radicals, and militarily because France threatens to invade both before and after Napoleon takes over. George is remarkably calm about the French trouble. In fact, he thought the French Revolution was divine punishment on the French for helping the rebels in his 13 colonies. Good enough for you. But violence spread to England as well. 2 assassins tried to kill George. The most serious was on May 15, 1800, and will remind you of another assassination. George was attending a play at the Drury Lane Theatre when James Hadfield, not an actor but a person in the audience, fired 2 shots at George. Both missed, and George told them after they arrested Hadfield to continue with the performance. George is so calm he goes to sleep during the intermission. Hadfield and the other assassin were declared insane and spent the rest of their lives under restraints. Politics becomes a problem as well. George's Governor General of Ireland, Lord Charles Cornwallis, yes, the Cornwallis of Yorktown, and his Prime Minister, William Pitt, were pushing for Catholic emancipation. I think it's time. But remember, George is head of the Church of England, and he takes that very seriously. He's afraid that if he agrees to Catholic emancipation, he's betraying one of his coronation oaths, which is to protect and preserve the Protestant faith. And so he will not support that. Many of his subjects agreed. There are massive riots in London called the Lord Gordon riots, and 300 people die in the riots. And so Lord Cornwallis resigns in protest, and King George forces William Pitt the Younger out of power, but not before William Pitt forces legislation through Parliament, the Act of Union, that unites, sort of, Great Britain and Ireland on 1 January 1801. Catholic emancipation will not occur until 1829, during George IV's reign. Now, our George had a relapse in 1801 and again in 1804, but he bounces back. Everything's good. Now his family's acting up. His daughter Sophia has a baby. She's not married. His sons are giving him regularly illegitimate grandchildren, so he's having a little trouble regulating the home front, but it's going okay. And in 1807, George agrees to abolish the slave trade, the British slave trade. It's a major shift for a man who defended slavery in the early days of his reign. And now he agrees. The law takes effect immediately in the sense that there's no more importation of slaves, and slaves in Great Britain itself are freed. It will be another 26 years before the slaves in the British colonies are freed. The Napoleonic Wars spread across the globe between 1803 and 1815. But there's Horatio Nelson winning his great victories at Copenhagen and Trafalgar. Wellington's busy rewriting all the military texts, often sounding remarkably like George Washington, as he fights his Peninsular War. George III had learned. This is one thing about George that we overlook. This is a man who learns from his mistakes, and he applies what he learns. And he's learned from the mistakes he made in the American Revolution, when King and Parliament micromanaged the generals in North America, often giving conflicting instructions. In March 1810, when Parliament was trying to replace Wellington, George told them, "Permit Wellington to proceed according to his judgment, undeterred by any particular instructions which might interfere in the execution of his general plan of operations." He didn't give anything like that during the American Revolution. This was one of the last and best decisions the king made. Wellington eventually defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in June 1815. But by then, George is no longer in power. At the end of 1810, his eyesight is failing and his old illness comes back. Until he was over 70, George was mad less than 6 months. But in 1810, he is permanently insane. On February the 6th, 1811, the Prince of Wales was sworn in as regent. The prince was 49. The last decade of George's life was sad. He was blind, eventually deaf, and lived in isolation in a few rooms in Windsor Castle. He refused to cut his beard. It became long, white beard. And he wore the same violet dressing gown every day with the Order of the Garter on it. He spent most of his time in various delusions, although he had moments of being aware and of being violent. He was not told of his wife's death in 1818. This time his family can visit, and his second and favorite son, Frederick, spends a great deal of time with him. And he is with him when George dies. His heir is not. George died on January 29th, 1820. He was 81. He had ruled for 60 years. At least he'd been king for 60 years. The last 10, of course, he had a regent. But he left an indelible mark on two countries, his own and ours. And after him come kings much less able. The end of the reigns of the House of Hanover. England is a constitutional monarchy and a democracy.